What if I told you that lurking in the shadows of World War II history is a ghost fleet? A fleet that, had it been built, might have completely rewritten the story of the war at sea. We're not talking about U-boats or the mighty Bismarck. We're talking about Nazi Germany's forgotten dream, aircraft carriers. What if Germany built aircraft carriers instead of pocket battleships? Hi everyone and welcome back to the Jaxom Talks channel. Today we are looking at a what-if with regards to ships of World War II. The German pocket battleships, the Graf Spee, the Admiral, the Deutschland. They were commerce raiders, built under the shadow of the Versailles Treaty, designed to punch above their weight and run from anything bigger. They caused chaos, they tied up allied navies, but were they the future? The future of naval warfare was already here, flying off the decks of the USS Lexington and the HMS Ark Royal. So, here is the question that changes everything for the Kriegsmarine. What if Hitler and Admiral Raeder decided to ditch the pocket battleships and pour every single drop of steel and funding into making aircraft carriers? From 1930 onwards. Let's ground this in reality. Why did the pocket battleships exist? The Treaty of Versailles limited Germany to warships of 10,000 tons displacement. The Panzerschiff were in fact the ultimate compromise, diesel engines for range with 11-inch guns for punch, and a revolutionary welded hull structure to save weight. They were treaty cheats, yes, but very successful ones. But imagine the alternative with Germany, already cheating the treaty on tonnage and gun size, commits to violating the spirit of the naval arms race even further. They cancelled the Panzership design path entirely. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, the head of the Kriegsmarine, was a traditional battleship man at heart. He believed in the power of big guns and thick armor, but even he couldn't ignore the winds of change. He saw what was happening elsewhere and knew that without air cover, his precious surface fleet would be sitting ducks. The result? The ambitious Plan Z, a massive naval expansion program designed to challenge the Royal Navy's dominance. The crown jewel of Plan Z was to be the Graf Zeppelin-class aircraft carriers. The lead ship, the Graf Zeppelin herself, was laid down in 1936. She was a beast of a vessel, designed to be over 860 feet long and displace more than 33,000 tons. On paper, she looked formidable, intended to carry a complement of around 42 aircraft. These weren't just any planes. They were specially modified versions of the Luftwaffe's finest, like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter and the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. Now instead, let's imagine they design a fleet of smaller, maybe 15,000 to 20,000 ton carriers, and let's call them the Weser class, small enough to build quickly but large enough to carry 40 to 50 planes. This is a massive commitment. It would have meant the prioritizing of naval air wings, years earlier, than when they started the Graf Zeppelin project. Honestly, it's highly unlikely that two carriers, operated by a navy with zero experience, would have been a significant threat. They would have caused havoc for a period of time. A successful raid on a convoy or a surprise attack on a British naval base like Scapa Flow would have been a huge propaganda victory and a tactical blow. This alternate history would have had an immediate impact on two things for sure: the Battle of the Atlantic and the invasion of Norway. In our timeline, U-boats and pocket battleships were surface raiders. They were hunters of the open seas. However, in this timeline the Germans would have 2 or 3 operational Weser-class carriers by late 1939. Scenario A, the Atlantic Terror. Instead of the lonely Bismarck raid, we have a carrier battle group. Imagine an early war convoy raid. The U-boats still do the grunt work, but now a carrier group can stand off and launch air attacks against the convoys themselves, forcing the Allied escorts to deal with both subsurface and aerial threats. Crucially, the carriers have a defensive screen of fighters. The Royal Navy suddenly has a much more complicated problem than just the Tirpitz. Scenario B, dominating Norway. The invasion of Norway in 1940 was a chaotic, bloody naval affair for Germany. They lost cruisers and destroyers and their ground troops faced constant air attack from Allied carriers. If Germany had 2 carriers providing immediate, dedicated air cover for the beachheads, the defenses in Norway would have collapsed much faster. It would become a critical test case for carrier-supported invasions which Germany passes with flying colors. The strategic shift is the biggest change. The pocket battleships were purely tactical. They were designed to disrupt. Carriers, even small ones, are strategic power projection. Raeder and Dönitz are now forced to think globally. Naval air doctrine in Germany is forced to develop carrier aviation doctrine early. They would require a specialized naval version of the Me-109 for fighter defense and the Ju-87 Stuka for dive bombing. This investment pulls resources away from the Luftwaffe's purely land-based focus, but gives the Navy a true voice. Focus on protection. Unlike the unfinished Graf Zeppelin, which was heavily armored like a cruiser, these smaller carriers would prioritize hangar space and speed. That said, their size or armament wasn't the biggest downside. They'd still lack escort ships. A carrier without a proper escort screen of cruisers and destroyers is just a large floating target. Germany's destroyer and cruiser programs were, from records, painfully slow. But here's where the alternate timeline crashes into reality. Even with a switch over to carriers, the overall result of the war in all likelihood wouldn't change. Why, you may ask? As with lots of elements for the Germans, it comes down to production capacity. The US and UK had industrial production that dwarfed Germany's, especially for naval construction. The United States alone produced over 100 carriers and escort carriers during the war. By 1943, even if Germany had 3 carriers, the Royal Navy and the US would field a dozen or more, each more capable than Germany's design. Our hypothetical Weser class would simply be overwhelmed by superior numbers. The ultimate fate of the German carrier fleet would likely be similar to that of the Tirpitz, bottled up in a Norwegian fjord, hunted relentlessly, and eventually sunk by overwhelming air power. So, Germany building carriers instead of pocket battleships wouldn't have won them the war. It would have made the early years of the Battle of the Atlantic a true nightmare. It would have accelerated naval air combat by years and shifted German naval doctrine from coastal defense to genuine ocean warfare. Think about the fate of the Bismarck. It was the most powerful battleship afloat at the time, but it was hunted down and sunk on its very first mission. A lone German carrier group would have faced a similar, if not worse fate. They would be a priority target for every Allied ship, submarine, and long-range aircraft in the Atlantic. In the end, Germany simply couldn't afford to lose them. The German aircraft carrier program was a fascinating what-if, but it was ultimately a strategic dead end. It was born from a desire to compete with the world's great navies, but was stifled by internal politics, flawed doctrine, and the overwhelming industrial and strategic realities of the war. It's a powerful lesson that a weapon is only as good as the strategy, experience, and industrial base that supports it. Germany had the engineering skill, but it lacked the vision and cohesion to become a true carrier power. The Ghost Fleet was destined to remain just that, a ghost. What do you think? Would a successful carrier program have convinced Hitler to launch Operation Sea Lion? Or would they have simply been sunk by the Royal Navy at the first opportunity? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this talk, please like the video, hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to ring the notification bell so you don't miss my next video. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one.